Welcome to this session on podcasting to a post-Christian world. And we are so happy we have John Dickson himself here. John Dickson is a man with a very interesting CV, musician, professional academic historian with a number of positions at different universities, and an author, a filmmaker, and now a very popular podcaster. Welcome, John.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Stefan. That's kind of you to say so. It's interesting that I feel more like a podcaster than I do an academic.
And today, we want you to be a 100% podcaster. Okay. So, first off, before we can say more about your podcast, what type of podcasts do you yourself like to listen to?
I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I think you need to in order to be a podcaster. Just to see what's out there, to see what's already being said, to see the different styles that people use. We often have people come to us at Undeceptions because we have several podcasts now, including my one, and they ask to have a podcast, and we will often ask them, what podcast do you already listen to? And they say, I don't listen to podcasts, I just want one. And I think, well, no, you really need to listen to them. That's a long-winded way of saying, I listen to a lot of different podcasts. And so some of my podcasts are political. And having moved to America, I'm trying to get my head around politics. So I listen to right-wing and left-wing podcasts. So I listen to Daily Wire podcasts, Ben Shapiro and so on. And then I listen to podcasts like ABC The Week, which is left-wing, or Pod Save America, which is left-wing. So I've got my political podcasts. I've got my history podcasts, like The Rest is History with Tom Holland. In Our Time, which I think is one of the best. It's just interview, but it's a beautiful BBC podcast that's now over 1,000 episodes. On getting scholars to make things simple for the audience. And then I listen to very artistic ones like 99% Invisible. I'm not sure if anyone knows that one from Radiotopia. And they just will do strange things like the subways that have been forgotten around, the latest episode I listened to, the subways that have been forgotten around America. They've just abandoned subways underneath cities that no one knows about. And they'll just do a sort of, how was this designed? Why was it forgotten? It's beautiful. I don't actually listen to many Christian podcasts. 99% Invisible. And it's all about design of buildings or bridges or subways or logos for big companies. And they somehow make that nerdy topic beautiful.
Thanks for interesting suggestions. What do you think is powerful with podcast as a platform? Why podcast over video? Why not a YouTube channel? Or you think about kind of classical Christian radio? What's so powerful with podcast?
Well, video is expensive. Podcast is less expensive. Unless you do it the way we do it, where it's very expensive. But generally, podcasting is cheaper. But it actually has some benefits. It can create an intimacy with the audience. And there are actually some studies coming out of the University of California that have shown that when people listen with headphones to messaging, they are more able to remember content and more persuadable than if they listen to the same content on loudspeakers. And 90% of people listen to podcasts with their headphones in. And so it creates an intimacy. I think the other thing about a podcast is that over time you can create a relationship with your audience where the characters of the podcast sort of become known. I mean, I will often meet people who, and it's delightful, they say like they know me, they feel they know me from the podcast, and I love that. But the other thing we do at Undeceptions is we include producer Kaylee, director Mark, and the others who work for the podcast in the show. So when we record sessions, we leave their mics open. We don't know what's going to happen. It's never scripted. But we'll sometimes, I'll be giving my lines and then I'll say, is that correct, producer Kaylee? Or what was that episode? And so actually people get to know the producer and director as well. By the way, there's my team that work on the podcast. And you can see I've got my naughty fingers above director Máhrik there. And that is actually, Máhrik and I go back 25 years of production of documentaries and so on. And I will almost always end a show by criticising Máhrik. And people are waiting for the next criticism of Máhrik. And this is the sort of way we end a show. But it's part of what makes people feel like they're friends with us. So I think, it's the intimacy, it's the friendships you can create with the audience, as well as the ease of expense.
Undeception is a very well produced podcast. How did you decide in terms of the format? Can you let us in on some of the secrets in your thinking there?
Well, we started 4 years ago, and director Máhrik and on the left there and producer Kaylee didn't know each other, but independently of each other came to me 4 years ago and said, you should start a podcast. And I said to them, no, everyone's got a podcast. It's so cliched. I don't want a podcast. And they said, no, meet with us. But they did it independently of each other, asking me to do a podcast. So I said, let's meet. We met at my home. And I told them what the podcast should be. And my idea for the podcast was very newsy, up to date, giving commentary on the needs of the day from a Christian perspective. And they said, no, that won't work. That's not the podcast you need to do. And I was like, what do you mean? And they said, no, what you need to do is a podcast that is about perennial issues that aren't going to go away. A podcast where people could go back a year from now and listen to an episode because it's still relevant, not because it was relevant in the week it came out. And so my whole vision for the podcast was overthrown. And they suggested a sort of slower format audio documentary podcast where we have scholar interviews at the core of it, and then they take the podcast and turn it into an audio documentary. So our podcasts sound more like BBC long-form documentaries than they do the sort of two people talking. The only thing they let me keep from my ideas was what I called a 5-minute Jesus. So in each podcast, what I do is I say, let's press pause. I've got a 5-minute Jesus for you. And no matter what the topic has been, Constantine, transgender, abortion, last week's episode on American evangelicals, the Venerable Bede, whatever it is, I'll do a 5-minute little monologue about how this relates to the figure of Jesus.
There are so many podcasts these days. How do you make Undeception to stand out amongst all this? Is it content, format, humor, music, or are you just working with the algorithm? Or how do you make Undeception stand out?
The easiest way to do a podcast is just to have interviews. It's cheap. It's why most podcasts are just interviews. It doesn't require much from the editor to edit. It's a very good format. It's the one I recommend. I don't recommend you do what we tried because you need 5 people to do what we do. And that is take the interview and turn it into an audio documentary. So my team, once they receive the interview files that I've recorded with Brendan Haug or whatever, they then take that, they lay it out like a proper storyboard, like a TV documentary, and they think about the dynamics. When does it get boring? When does John go on too much? When do we need an explainer? So we often do these chimes. They insert chimes where I have to do an editorial to explain something the scholar said. And then they'll pull a clip from CNN that relates to it, or they'll pull a clip from a movie. Then they'll find some beautiful music to play through it. And as a result, it requires a lot of work from the team. And so I think that what makes Undeceptions stand out and also cost a lot of money is that I have a team that can take an interview and turn it into a full-on documentary. The other thing I'd say about Undeceptions is that everything we do has the listener in mind who doesn't believe. And there aren't many Christian podcasts that are entirely for the person who doesn't believe. And we'll take any topic, but we're always thinking of how the doubter is going to approach this. And we approach it with top-level scholarship in a very simple format, simply explained. And we are one of the mottos is that we want to be a PhD in a pair of old jeans. I see Jan in a beautiful pair of old jeans there, right? We want to be a PhD in a pair of jeans. And it's got to feel like that for listeners. And I think that does make the podcast just pop.
There is a growing number of Christian podcasts these days. A lot of them are actually just sermons being published online. What do you think about that, and why do you think so many Christian podcasts are like that?
This is very simple. It's cheap. It's cheap to do that, to just put your sermon online in a podcast, or maybe do a sermon followed by a conversation between the pastor. Lots of pastors do this. They then analyze with someone what the sermon was trying to do. And that's great. I think it's fantastic. We created a rod for our own back by trying to turn this into an audio documentary, a sort of a whole audio soundscape where the interview with an expert is just woven through a whole storyboard. Yeah, that's a simple question. Money.
Money. I guess a number of people here in the media network are thinking about starting a podcast, dreaming about a podcast, and a number of them are already running podcasts. But if someone is thinking about launching a new project, starting a podcast, what would you tell them? How can you help a up-and-coming podcaster?
You've got to work out what your reason for being is. What is the thing that's going to pop? So unless you have a very clear idea of what will distinguish this podcast, it's going to be hard to get a large audience. The other thing is consistent quality. People are increasingly used to very high quality sound, especially because a lot of the listening is through very good headphones. And as headphones get better and better quality, we're exposed when the quality is not great. So you've got to work for consistent quality. It's not super expensive to get good quality, but it can cost a little bit. And I would say, and I should make clear that Undeceptions has amazing backers. So if you're able to get backers, sponsors, who love your idea and really support you for the podcast, that will catapult you. We couldn't survive just by subscriptions, advertising dollars, and call-outs. Hey, do you want to support Undeceptions? We couldn't survive. I mean, that does raise a significant amount of money, probably a couple of the salaries that work on the show. But the rest of it comes from a couple of very generous benefactors. So there's a recommendation. Try and get some benefactors.
Good sound and strong support. Okay. You have already touched on this, but what is the aim of the podcast Undeception? How clearly have you defined your aim with what you're doing?
Very clearly. We are trying to bring a thoughtful, generous Christianity to people who don't know what to make of Christianity. Yeah? So Orthodox Christianity defined by the creeds, generous Christianity marked by the humility of Jesus, but constantly with the doubter in mind, listening. And although we deal with very difficult topics, and sometimes very theological topics, we think there's always a way that the doubter is going to benefit from it. So, you know, I said we did an episode on the Venerable Bede, right? The great 8th century scholar in Britain. You might think, why would any person who's not a Christian be interested in that? But actually, when you think about it, it leaves the person who's not a Christian with this overwhelming impression there were super smart Christians in the middle of the Dark Ages. Maybe there weren't any Dark Ages. And so that's a real benefit. And we go to the effort of interviewing the top Bede scholar in the world at Oxford University and pulling in all sorts of clips and so on. But the goal is to leave that person with that impression. We often jokingly say that the goal is to leave the person who's not a Christian thinking Christians aren't as dumb or mean as we thought. And I reckon that's a massive win, because there are a lot of people who think we are dumb and we are mean-spirited. And if we can take an issue and leave them thinking, wow, that sounded like a traditional Christian, but they didn't sound dumb, they didn't sound mean. You've taken that issue aside as a blocker for the gospel. They're left a little more open. Can I give you an example? So we did an episode, this is the most popular episode we've done, transgender. And we take a completely classical view of sex and gender. We had a top psychologist who works in the area on the show. The one thing we were missing was an actual transgender voice. And so we took the risk of inviting onto the show Dana Farm, a transgender woman, a biological male who identifies as a woman, so that people would hear the experience of a transgender person, and I could put questions to Dana that hopefully left the person who's not a Christian thinking, wow, that Christian holds the view that there are just two biological sexes and you can't traverse them, but actually got along really well with that transgender woman. As I say, it is the most popular of our shows, and our aim was just to leave people who aren't Christians thinking those Christians aren't as dumb and mean as we thought on that issue. Not by compromising, but by crafting a really human conversation.
That's a beautiful way of handling a difficult and sensitive issue. You describe your aim, and I really like them. Often we have aims for our ministries and so on, which becomes kind of general aim for what we are doing. Are you evaluating each and every episode out from your aim, or how free are you in terms of that?
The team is constantly reviewing how the episode went. I don't look at that sort of thing much at all, to be honest with you. As in, I don't look at the numbers. You know, how well did that episode do? The team just tell me what works and what doesn't. But we get a lot of mail, emails and messages from people asking us questions. And every season, we do a Q&A episode. So it's toward the end of each season. We just collate all the questions that people have written in or recorded for us. And then I just am in the hot seat answering people's questions. And we can tell from the questions that we are connecting with people who aren't believers. In fact, one of the episodes you can see there, the bottom left, on Buddhism. This is a good example of what we're trying to do. The episode on Buddhism, we interviewed both a Buddhist convert, that is a convert from Buddhism to Christianity, who's also the Archbishop of Sydney and a Sri Lankan Buddhist formerly. But we also interviewed a professor of Buddhism at Oxford University, who was a Buddhist and an advocate for Buddhism. And we designed this so that the story of the Archbishop was beautifully told without any criticism of Buddhism, but just why he eventually found himself drawn to Jesus. And we let the Buddhist expert explain Buddhism the whole way through the show, and they just sort of wove through each other. And then in the last 10 minutes, we thought, well, how are we going to end this? And it would have been the easiest thing in the world to end with the Jesus pitch. And we decided not to. We just decided Jesus sells himself. So why don't we let the Buddhist scholar have the last word and explain what is so beautiful about Buddhism? And so that's how that show ends. It's the sort of show where Christians might be disappointed with us. And that's worth remembering. If you're trying to reach people who aren't Christians, you will annoy Christians. It is a universal rule. However, a month or so later, I got an email from the chaplain on a submarine in the Australian Navy saying that his commander of the submarine is a Buddhist and really into science. So she was a Theravada Buddhist, the less religious Buddhist, and into science. And he said, I've given her a couple of your science episodes to listen to. She's really intrigued. And then I've given her your Buddhist episode. And I was very nervous. And she's just listened to it. And she now is telling me she's thinking of becoming a Christian. Thank you. A couple of days later, I was able to reply to this commander, to this naval chaplain. And he emailed straight back to say, you'll never guess, my commander has become a Christian here on the submarine. And she's going to get baptized next time we're back in port. And it turns out that one of the things that compelled her was that we didn't need to end the Buddhism episode with the Christian. She said she felt like Christianity was so solid, it didn't need to be pushed. And that when she heard the Buddhist scholar describe what was most beautiful about Buddhism, she found herself thinking, I prefer Jesus. And indeed, when they came back, she was baptized, and I was able to send a message that was read at her baptism. And I can't remember what question I was answering now, but it
was a good answer.
Okay, it's an answer to something. But it's a good indication of what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're going about it.
We just listened to a clip from the most popular episode of the podcast. Personally, can you tell us about some of your own favorite episodes from your point of view?
This was actually also very popular, but surprisingly so, because it is perhaps the nerdiest of all the podcasts that we've done, because here is an expert on what happened between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So it's all about the rise of the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Essenes and what the Hasmonean kingdom was like and how the Romans came in, and it just set up the context of the New Testament. And yet, for any history buff, it was utterly intriguing. But it also left people thinking, wow, when Jesus came, he answered all these questions that the previous hundreds of years had been asking. So this is one of my favorite. I absolutely love this. And one of the great things about this is my producer, Kaylee, went out and found an Israeli band that plays Israeli folk music. And we asked if we could use their music in our show, which they were very kindly did.
You have a very wide ministry, speaking, teaching, writing books, making documentaries. How does the podcasting in Deception fits into that, and in what way does it support your kind of wider ministry?
Ever since I became a Christian, I've thought that I really just do one thing. I'm trying to make Jesus public in a very post-Christian setting. And so initially, I did that as a musician. My first career was as a singer-songwriter. Not that I thought I was a very good singer-songwriter, but I thought it was a great way to make Christ public. And then I turned to academia. Not that I ever thought I'd be a very good academic, but I believed it would be a great way to make Christ more public. I ended up doing theology as well, ancient history. I started writing books, but never saw myself as literary. I just wanted to make Christ public, which is all to say the podcast just seems more of that. My life sometimes looks like I can't decide what I want to be when I grow up. You know, are you an academic? Are you a singer? Are you a writer? Are you a podcaster? It's just, when I grow up, I just want to make Jesus more public in a post-Christian setting. And so the podcast really is just doing the one thing I've always done in a different format. It's a format that I love. It's a format that has reached way more people than my preaching could ever reach. So I'm deeply thankful to God for it.
One last question from me. We started this session with the beautiful music from In Deception. And when the music was played, you whispered to me, oh, the classical musicians here will be upset. Yes. Will you explain why you said that?
Well, I mean, those of you who know Bach's Prelude to the Cello Suites hear this and think, what? That's all I meant. So anyone who's a purist is looking down on me right from the beginning. But my argument is that we're just a PhD in a pair of jeans, and so the theme song is deliberately both classical, the most sublime, arguably the most sublime piece of music written, the cello suites. But with a totally modern rock and roll approach that says what we're trying to do.
Beautiful. I would like now to invite a European podcaster, Jan. Will you come here? And if you have questions or reflections to John.
So I really enjoyed the interview. Thank you very much. And at the beginning, you said that you do not prefer posting podcasts as a video on YouTube or any other platform, but some people say that the YouTube is the future Google, and that's the reason for some podcasters to go to the YouTube. They start with the podcast, but go to the video podcast. Do you have any ideas about that?
Yes, I mean, we are on YouTube, but the way we do it is we take our audio podcasts, reduce them to 5 minutes, or just grabs from a podcast for 5 minutes, and then produce animations. And so, you know, the hour-long podcast on rest, the science of rest, is turned into a 5-minute animation on rest, where there's a little bit of science, there's a little bit of theology, and that's up on YouTube. That's our little dipping the toe into YouTube. I totally agree with you about the future. It's just that the way we've set up our podcast, it would be inordinately expensive to try and produce a YouTube video that looks like our podcast sounds. So we have created this burden for ourselves. If we got $1 million, we would probably want to do that. But until then, all we're going to do is throw grabs to YouTube.
So what other channels or hooks do you use in order to get people to listen to your podcast or advertisement?
So we advertise on social media. So we do paid advertising on social media. But I also have an employed social media person who produces all these lovely graphics and then pushes them out through social media channels. And we don't spend a lot of money on that. And mostly, I think it's word of mouth. I think we have the sort of podcasts that Christians listen to and send to their friends who aren't Christians. And it's that we have a very loyal base of people who want their friends to listen to this. So they are spreading it out for us.
And you said that if you want to create this format of podcast, you need 5 people on staff at least.
Yeah.
So what are the roles of the people, and how long does it take to produce one episode?
So we have a producer who is really in charge of the whole show. In fact, she's in charge of the other shows we have. We have 2 other podcasts in our channel. We have a director Máhrik, who sort of directs how each episode will go, the storyboarding. We have a researcher and writer, and his role is basically once he gets the scholar interview that I send them, he will then work out what would be the best clip from CNN or BBC, or what movie clip will he get, and he'll sort of pull together the additional research required. If he thinks there's a topic that needs to be treated more deeply within the podcast, he'll go and he'll read several articles, he'll produce a brief for me so that I can more easily get my head around it. Then we have a social media person, and I have a PA, an EA, an executive assistant, who works for me not just with the podcast, but all my speaking and writing and everything else. Did you have another question?
How long does it take to produce one?
Produce one, well, it depends how complicated it is. But sometimes I will fly somewhere to produce a podcast. So we produced a double episode, it's not up there, on, let me just get rid of that weird thing. We produced a double episode on the Vikings. How did the Vikings become Christians? And so I flew to Denmark and interviewed 4 of the top Viking scholars. And it was awesome. So that was 3 days of my time to get 4 interviews. And then it went to my team. And I imagine it took them a week to storyboard and find all the other things they wanted to do. And then one episode takes 2 days of audio engineering. So our audio editor spends 2 full days, 16 hours on one episode. The way we started this was crazy. We shouldn't have done it this way. But there you are, we're stuck.
The podcast, unbelievable, Justin Riley, they also need some conference, so they need some follow-up with the podcast. Do you have any plans with this?
Yes, in fact, we ran an Undeceptions conference in Australia, in Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne last year. And it was fantastic because this was a Christian conference for people who aren't Christians. And we had people who weren't Christians turn up. And we had people become Christians. There was no altar call or anything like that, but people just were compelled by what went on. We did some live shows, like we actually recorded live shows at this conference. But then we had speakers, like Rebecca McLaughlin and Rachel Gilson from the US. We had some top Australian academic communicators. And so over the 2-day conference, maybe 8 different talks, some breakout seminars. No praise and worship music, so it was not a Christian conference, but we had the Undeceptions band who would play different versions of the theme tune. So that's the rock version, but they played a jazz version, they played hip hop version, they played classical version, and so on. And so it was just super fun as well. So yeah, we gave it a go. It was a great success. It cost a bomb, and we just broke even. Okay. So my team is unsure whether we want to do it again because they really broke their back doing it. But actually, when I'm back in Australia in July, we're doing some live shows around Australia. So not conferences, but just some live recordings of shows.
Is the conference online on YouTube somewhere?
I don't know. That's a very good question. I'll have to ask my team.
So one more and last question from me. One of the most listened to and highly produced podcasts in the Christian world was The Rise and Fall of Marshall Church. And you said you don't listen to Christian podcasts so much. So my question would be, did you listen to this podcast? And what's your professional commentary on the quality of the podcast or the type of the production?
Yes, I did. So when I say I don't really listen to Christian podcasts, it's not like a rule.
Okay.
It's just, I have other things I want to listen to. But yeah, I definitely did with that. I was quite late to the party, actually. I only listened to it maybe a year ago. But my professional opinion is it is brilliant, arguably the best Christian podcast ever produced. Yeah, so it was amazing and impressive. It was entirely for Christians. I'm not sure I'd want doubters, skeptics listening to that, because there just wasn't much recovery. I think every Christian should listen to it as a salient warning, but Undeceptions is trying to do something very different.
Thank you so much.